I wasn't looking for a conspiracy. I was researching Chicago's architectural history, scrolling through digitized archives from the Chicago Historical Society when I found a photograph that made me stop cold. The image was dated 1868, 3 years before the Great Fire. It showed State Street, one of the downtown's main arteries, and something was profoundly wrong. The buildings weren't sitting on the ground, they were emerging from it. Grand commercial structures, complete with ornate cornices and detailed stonework, had their first floors buried beneath street level. Basement windows sat at what should have been ground level. Entrance doors opened onto sidewalks that were clearly excavated down, not built up. The photograph showed workers with shovels and carts, systematically digging out the street to expose buried architecture. I checked the caption: Street Raising Operations, State Street, 1868. The official explanation was simple. Chicago had raised its streets to install sewage systems and improve drainage in the swampy terrain. Standard urban development for a growing city. But then I found another photograph, and another, dozens of them, showing the same phenomenon across different districts, different years. Buildings standing half buried, streets being excavated rather than elevated, architectural elements emerging from mud and soil that covered them completely. These weren't photographs of construction. They were photographs of excavation. The official story claims Chicago was built rapidly between 1830 and 1870, a frontier town transformed into a major city in just 4 decades. But these images showed something different. They showed sophisticated stone buildings, already standing, already complete, being dug out from layers of accumulated earth. Buildings that would have required decades to construct using 19th century methods, yet appeared fully formed beneath the mud. I couldn't ignore the question forming in my mind. What if Chicago's Great Fire wasn't about destroying what had been built, but about erasing what had been found? The timeline never made sense. I had accepted it without question, like everyone else. But when I started calculating the actual numbers, the official story collapsed under its own weight. Chicago was incorporated as a town in 1833 with a population of 350 people. By 1871, just 38 years later, it had become America's fourth largest city, with over 300,000 residents and more than 60,000 buildings. The downtown district featured massive stone structures, ornate hotels, commercial blocks with cast iron facades, and an extensive network of underground passages connecting basements across multiple city blocks. Let me put that in perspective. In 38 years, working with 1830s, 1860s technology, horse-drawn carts, hand tools, manual labor, Chicago supposedly transformed from prairie grass into an architectural marvel that rivaled cities in Europe that had been developing for centuries. The mathematics don't work. Stone buildings of the scale photographed in pre-fire Chicago required quarrying, cutting, transporting multi-ton blocks, skilled stonemasons working for years on individual structures. The Palmer House Hotel alone, completed in 1870, was a 7-story stone edifice covering an entire city block. Modern construction estimates suggest such a building would require 3 to 4 years, with contemporary equipment and techniques. Yet Chicago's building records claim hundreds of similar structures were erected simultaneously during the 1850s and 1860s, a period when the city was supposedly still struggling with basic infrastructure. The workforce required would have been astronomical, the logistics impossible. Where did the skilled stonemasons come from? How were multi-ton granite blocks transported across unpaved prairie? Who financed this explosive growth in a frontier settlement? The official narrative describes a construction boom without precedent in human history, yet provides no detailed documentation of how it was actually accomplished. No contemporary accounts describe the massive workforce this would have required. No records explain the sudden appearance of advanced architectural techniques in a town that had been wilderness a generation earlier. Unless, of course, they weren't building at all. Unless they were uncovering. The photographic evidence is undeniable once you know what you're looking at. Between 1855 and 1870, Chicago conducted what they called the largest civic engineering project in American history, systematically raising the street level across the entire downtown district by 4 to 14 feet. I found dozens of photographs documenting this process. but they tell a very different story than the official explanation suggests. In image after image, I saw buildings that were already complete, already standing, with their ground floors buried beneath accumulated sediment. The street raising wasn't elevating roads to improve drainage. It was excavating streets that had been buried, exposing buildings that had been covered by layers of earth and mud. One photograph from 1858 shows the Tremont House Hotel. The building is magnificent, 4 stories of limestone with elaborate cornices and architectural detailing. But it's sitting in a pit. The street around it has been dug down to expose what had been basement windows, now functioning as ground floor entrances. Workers stand in the excavated trench, dwarfed by the scale of the structure they're uncovering. Another image from 1860 shows an entire block on Lake Street. Every building has been exposed down to what should be basement level. Sidewalks run through trenches carved into the earth. The buildings themselves show no signs of recent construction. The stonework is weathered, the architectural style consistent with much older European designs, not frontier American construction. The most telling detail appears in a photograph from 1861. It shows a cross-section view where a building is being raised with jack screws, a common technique in the street raising project. But the foundation visible beneath the building extends far deeper than any structure supposedly built in the 1840s or 1850s would require. The stonework at the lowest levels shows different weathering patterns, darker coloration, water damage consistent with long-term submersion. These weren't new buildings being adjusted for improved streets. These were old buildings being excavated from a mudflood that had buried them decades, possibly centuries, before Chicago was officially founded. The Great Chicago Fire of October 8 to 10, 1871, was remarkably selective in what it destroyed. According to official records, the fire consumed 3.3 square miles of the city, yet the burn pattern raises questions that have never been adequately answered. I mapped the destruction zone against pre-fire photographs showing mudflood evidence. The correlation was disturbing. The fire obliterated the entire downtown core, precisely the area where street excavations had exposed the most elaborate buried architecture. It consumed the commercial district where buildings with the most sophisticated stonework and oldest architectural styles had been uncovered. The wealthy residential areas along the lakefront where massive limestone mansions sat in excavated pits burned completely. But here's what's strange. The fire jumped across entire blocks, leaving some structures untouched, while incinerating everything around them. The water tower survived, standing alone in a sea of destruction. Several buildings along the southern edge of the burn zone remained perfectly intact, while structures directly adjacent were reduced to ash. This isn't how fires behave naturally, especially not the uncontrollable inferno described in official accounts. The fire's borders are too perfect. The northwestern edge follows street lines with geometric precision, as if the destruction had been planned rather than chaotic. Contemporary maps show the burn zone ending exactly at district boundaries, stopping at infrastructure lines that would have meant nothing to spreading flames. Even more suspicious is what happened in areas that didn't burn. Neighborhoods showing less mudflood evidence in pre-fire photographs, areas with newer, simpler wooden construction, were largely spared. The south side, where buildings sat at proper street level without requiring excavation, sustained minimal damage despite being downwind of the main fire. Weather records from October 8-10, 1871 show moderate winds, not the hurricane-force gales the official narrative describes. Temperature and humidity data don't support the firestorm explanation. The fire supposedly generated its own weather system, creating winds strong enough to hurl burning debris across the Chicago River, yet delicate wooden structures on the periphery survived intact. The destruction pattern suggests intention, not accident. It targeted exactly what needed to be erased. What they found in the ruins tells the real story. I spent weeks searching through post-fire excavation reports, salvage records, and rebuilding documentation. The official narrative focuses on destruction and loss, but the buried details reveal something far more interesting: what lay beneath the city they claim to have built. Reconstruction crews digging foundations for new buildings encountered elaborate underground systems that shouldn't have existed. Drainage tunnels constructed with advanced engineering techniques, built from cut stone blocks fitted with precision joints. Underground passages connecting buildings across entire city blocks, featuring vaulted brick ceilings and decorative tile work. These weren't crude frontier constructions. They were sophisticated infrastructure that would challenge modern contractors. One salvage report from 1872 describes workers uncovering a basement level beneath what had been considered the lowest floor of a burned commercial building. The space contained stone columns with carved capitals, floor mosaics, and wall frescoes that showed water damage and sediment layers. The architectural style didn't match anything supposedly built in Chicago's brief 38-year history. The foreman's notes describe the find as inexplicable and inconsistent with known construction dates. The report disappeared from official archives within months. I found it referenced in a private diary, but the actual document is gone. Multiple newspaper accounts from late 1871 and early 1872 mention curious discoveries during debris clearing, carved stonework displaying techniques unknown to local masons, foundation stones bearing weathering patterns indicating centuries of age, metal fixtures using alloys that contemporary metallurgists couldn't identify. These stories ran for a few weeks, then stopped appearing. The narrative shifted quickly to Chicago's miraculous rebuilding, and questions about what had been found beneath the ashes simply ceased. One photograph from the cleanup operations shows a work crew standing around a partially excavated stone structure. The visible portion displays classical architectural elements, fluted columns, decorative friezes, far more sophisticated than frontier Chicago's supposed capabilities. The image is labeled only Basement Excavation, Unknown Location, 1872. No building name, no address, no follow-up documentation explaining what they found or what happened to it. The speed of Chicago's reconstruction defies everything we know about 19th century building capabilities. The official story celebrates it as a testament to American ingenuity and determination. But when you examine the actual timeline and methods, the celebration starts to look like misdirection. Within 2 years of the fire, Chicago had rebuilt over 10,000 structures. By 1875, the downtown district had been completely reconstructed, with buildings that were supposedly larger and more elaborate than those that burned. The new Palmer House Hotel rose in less than 2 years, a massive stone and brick structure covering an entire city block, featuring ornate detailing, modern amenities, and engineering complexity that rivals contemporary construction. I consulted with a structural engineer who specializes in historical building methods. His assessment was blunt: impossible. The timeline doesn't allow for it, even with unlimited labor and resources. Stone construction of that scale requires curing time for mortar, settling periods for foundations, sequential phases that cannot be rushed. What they're describing would require techniques we didn't develop until the 20th century. But here's what's even more revealing. Construction photographs from the rebuilding period don't show what you'd expect. When buildings are being erected from scratch, you see foundations being laid, walls rising incrementally, structural frameworks being assembled. The Chicago rebuilding photographs show something different. They show excavation, massive amounts of earth being removed, existing stone foundations being exposed and cleaned, walls emerging from trenches rather than being constructed upward. In image after image, workers with shovels appear to be uncovering rather than building. One photograph, labeled Construction of the Nevada Hotel, 1872, shows a 4-story stone building that's clearly already standing. The workers in frame aren't laying bricks or cutting stone. They're removing debris and excavated soil from around an existing structure. The stonework shows weathering patterns consistent with long-term burial, not fresh construction. The reconstruction wasn't building Chicago from scratch. It was excavating what the fire's heat had helped to uncover, removing the layers of mud and sediment that the flames had dried and made removable, exposing the buried city that had always been there. Chicago wasn't alone. The same night the Great Chicago Fire began, October 8, 1871, Peshtigo, Wisconsin burned. Not just burned, it was annihilated. Over 1,200 people died in what remains the deadliest fire in American history, yet most people have never heard of it. The official explanation blames dry conditions and strong winds. But the coincidence of 2 massive fires igniting simultaneously, 250 miles apart, on the same night, has never been adequately addressed. And when you start looking at the pattern, it gets worse. That same night, Holland, Michigan burned. Manistee, Michigan burned. Port Huron, Michigan burned. Forestville, Wisconsin burned. At least a dozen communities across the Great Lakes region experienced catastrophic fires within a 48-hour window. The official story describes this as an unfortunate confluence of drought conditions and autumn winds. But I mapped these towns against pre-fire photographs and municipal records. Every single one had evidence of mudflood characteristics. Peshtigo had conducted street excavations in the 1860s, uncovering buildings with basement levels that required digging down rather than building up. Holland's downtown district featured stone structures displaying architectural sophistication far beyond a frontier lumber town, supposedly founded in 1847. Manistee had underground passages and drainage systems that predated its official establishment. The pattern extends beyond 1871. San Francisco's Great Fire of 1906 destroyed a city showing extensive mudflood evidence in pre-disaster photographs. The timing followed a convenient earthquake, but the fire's spread pattern defied natural behavior, jumping fire breaks and consuming specific districts while sparing others. Baltimore burned in 1904, specifically targeting its oldest downtown core where pre-fire images show buried first floors and excavated streets. Seattle's Great Fire of 1889 obliterated the original downtown, which photographs reveal had been systematically excavated during the 1880s to expose buried architecture. Boston burned in 1872, just 1 year after Chicago. The destruction zone precisely matched areas where the city had raised street levels in the 1850s and 1860s, exposing buildings that had been buried. Contemporary accounts describe the same suspiciously perfect burn patterns, the same geometric precision in destruction zones. Mrs. O'Leary's cow supposedly kicked over a lantern in a barn on DeKoven Street, igniting the most destructive urban fire in American history. It's the story every schoolchild learns. It's also demonstrably false, yet it remains the official explanation. The cow story first appeared in the Chicago Republican newspaper on October 18, 1871, 10 days after the fire. No eyewitnesses were cited. No investigation had been conducted. The article simply claimed that a cow belonging to Catherine O'Leary had kicked over a lantern, starting the blaze. The story was repeated, embellished, and became accepted fact despite having no evidentiary foundation. In 1893, Michael Ahern, the reporter who wrote the original story, published a confession, admitting he fabricated the entire narrative. He stated explicitly that he made up the cow story because editors wanted a simple, memorable explanation. His retraction was largely ignored. The lie was more convenient than the truth. But the real problems with the official ignition story run deeper than journalistic fabrication. Weather records from October 8, 1871, show moderate winds of 15-20 mph. Strong, but not exceptional. Yet the fire supposedly generated winds powerful enough to hurl burning debris across the Chicago River, a distance of over 300 feet, igniting buildings on the opposite bank. This requires wind speeds exceeding 60 mph and temperatures capable of creating a self-sustaining firestorm. Fire behavior specialists describe firestorms as extremely rare events requiring specific conditions, extensive fuel loads, confined areas creating updraft channels, and ignition patterns that allow heat accumulation before spread. None of these conditions existed in Chicago's layout. The city was built on flat terrain with regular street grids, providing natural fire breaks. Water sources were abundant. The fire department, though overwhelmed, was well equipped and experienced. Contemporary meteorological data doesn't support the perfect storm scenario. Temperature, humidity, and wind measurements from surrounding weather stations show normal October conditions. No evidence exists for the hurricane-force winds described in official accounts. The fire's spread pattern, jumping across rivers, igniting multiple simultaneous fire fronts, burning in directions contrary to prevailing winds, violates basic fire science. The cow story exists to prevent deeper questions about ignition patterns that suggest multiple, coordinated starting points across the city. The systematic erasure of evidence began almost immediately after the fire and continues to this day. I've spent months searching for pre-fire documentation that should exist, but has mysteriously vanished from every major archive. Chicago's building permit records from 1833 to 1871 are incomplete at best, entirely missing for most years. The city claims they were destroyed in the fire, But building permit offices were located in multiple districts, several of which didn't burn. Detailed construction records, the kind that would definitively prove when and how buildings were erected, simply don't exist for Chicago's supposedly explosive growth period. The Chicago Historical Society holds thousands of post-fire photographs, but maintains surprisingly few comprehensive pre-fire street-level images of the downtown core. The photographs that do exist often lack proper documentation. No dates, no photographer credits, no location details beyond vague district names. Images showing the most dramatic mudflood evidence have the poorest provenance. Several photographs I found referenced in 1920s historical journals are now marked as lost or damaged beyond recovery in current archives. Ground-level survey maps from the 1850s and 1860s, documents that would show original street elevations before the raising projects, are missing from municipal archives. The city claims they were routine documents not deemed worthy of preservation. Yet far less important, administrative records from the same period survive in abundance. The specific documents that would reveal what Chicago looked like before excavation have disappeared. Academic silence on the mudflood phenomenon is deafening. Mainstream historians dismiss questions about buried buildings and impossible construction timelines as conspiracy theories, yet refuse to address the photographic evidence or provide detailed explanations for the documented anomalies. Architecture departments at major universities don't study Chicago's street raising project in engineering terms. They treat it as a footnote in urban planning history, avoiding technical analysis of how such work was supposedly accomplished with 1850s technology. When I contacted the Chicago Architecture Foundation requesting access to pre-fire building surveys and construction documentation, I received a polite response directing me to the same incomplete archives I'd already searched. Follow-up inquiries went unanswered. The gatekeeping is subtle but effective. The pattern emerges with disturbing clarity when you map it globally. Chicago's fire wasn't an isolated incident or even an American phenomenon. It fits precisely into a worldwide template of urban destruction, concentrated in a narrow historical window. Between 1850 and 1906, every major city showing photographic evidence of mudflood characteristics, buried first floors, excavated streets, impossible construction timelines, experienced a catastrophic fire or natural disaster that destroyed its oldest districts. San Francisco, 1906. London's repeated fires throughout the 1860s, 1880s, each consuming specific historical districts. Hamburg, 1842. Copenhagen, 1795 and 1807. Melbourne, 1897. Boston, 1872. Seattle, 1889. The list extends across continents, cultures, and climates. These weren't random urban fires. They follow a pattern. Each targeted city had recently conducted or was conducting large-scale excavation projects, street raising, sewer installation, underground construction that exposed buried architecture. Each fire destroyed precisely the districts where the most sophisticated pre-existing buildings had been uncovered. Each was followed by rapid reconstruction that looked suspiciously like continued excavation rather than new construction. The timing is impossibly coordinated. In an era without global communication systems, cities on different continents experienced nearly identical sequences: excavation of buried buildings, catastrophic fire, rapid rebuilding, systematic erasure of pre-fire documentation. The official explanations vary: cow lanterns, earthquakes, arson, accident. But the outcome is always the same. Evidence of an earlier, more advanced civilization disappears in flames. Chicago's Great Fire wasn't about Mrs. O'Leary's cow or dry weather conditions. It was about erasing proof of what had been found beneath the mud. The speed of the rebuild wasn't American exceptionalism. It was the completion of an excavation project that the fire had inadvertently advanced by drying and cracking the layers of accumulated sediment. What they called destruction was actually exposure. What they called reconstruction was actually revelation, followed by immediate suppression. The buried city of Chicago had begun to emerge through systematic excavation in the 1850s and 1860s. The fire of 1871 accelerated that process dangerously, revealing too much too quickly. So they burned it. They burned the evidence, rewrote the history, and gave us a story about a cow.